The Wreck at Richmond Switch, April 19th, 1873. The first railroad line in Rhode Island connected Providence and Boston, for the construction and operation of which a charter was granted in 1831. It was, however, not until 1834 that a steam train went from Boston as far as Canton, and a year later, in June 1835, the first train came from Boston to Providence with a station at India Point, about the present location of the Providence end of the Washington Bridge. A railroad from Boston to Providence seemed very necessary in those days. Not only did they want better transportation between the two important New England cities, but also needed to provide an overland connection between Boston and the steamboat line out of Providence to New York. A railroad would avoid the slow and dangerous route around Cape Cod. A steamboat out of Providence could make the run more than a century ago to New York in about 14 hours, but there was still the rough passage around Point Judith. In 1832, a railroad was chartered to run from Stonington, Connecticut to Providence. It was completed in 1837, following the present route along the shore. Travelers from Boston to Providence could now take the so-called, quote, boat train to Stonington. There in its excellent deep-water harbor, they could take a palatial side-wheel steamer and be lulled to sleep on the quiet water of the Sound leading down East River to the great metropolis. The railroad from Providence to Stonington was always known by the older residents of Rhode Island as the, quote, Stonington Road. This was not so strange, as there was in the early days no through connection with the Boston and Providence line. The Providence station of the Stonington line was on the shore of the river near the present Roger Williams Park, and passengers, after leaving their train from Boston at India Point, were ferried across the harbor in a ferry boat named the Stonington to board the train for Stonington at the station near the park. The two roads did not have a through connection until the filling in of the cove in Providence and building of the Union Station in 1890. Leading from the harbor side in Stonington, the right-of-way extended easterly across the village. It passed the old Congregational Church to the open country in Westerly. From there it touched the point today known as Bradford, Carolina, Shannock, and Kenyon, crossing the Pawcatuck River several times before plunging bravely through the Great Kingston Swamp. The construction of the road bed through the swamp and other low, wet areas was a triumph in engineering skill in those days of hand shovel and wheelbarrow labor. However, for the first few years, the train was not allowed to enter the village, and passengers were carried by horse-drawn wagons from the end of the line to the boats in the harbor. The distance from Providence to Stonington in those early days was covered by the wood-burning locomotives in about 2 hours and 20 minutes. The old wood burners used about 2 cords of wood en route. The boat train had many years of service even after the roads had been connected at Providence, had become the shoreline of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, and extended all the way to New York. By 1850, all the rivers along the Connecticut shore had been bridged. Through connections had been made to New York, but the trip to Stonington and sail down the Sound remained the popular way to reach New York well into the present century. By that time, Boston travelers also had the Fall River line. I well remember the whistle of the boat train each night as it passed by Kingston, and how folks would say, "It must be about 9 o'clock, there goes the boat train." I think many of our older people, having no radios in those days, set their clocks by that 9 p.m. whistle. I should have mentioned that the first Kingston station was located near what was formerly the Agway plant on the Waits Corner Road. It was moved to a new location, and the present station built in 1875. One had to be an early riser to get the boat train to Providence, as the steamer from New York usually arrived at Stonington about 3:30 in the morning, and the train would leave at 4 o'clock. On the morning of April 19th, 1873, the boat train was made up of 2 first class, 1 second class, and a smoking car. In charge of conductor Orrin Gardner and engineer William Guile, it was waiting for the passengers to transfer from the steamer, which had arrived at the usual time. Just as the boat train was about to pull out of Stonington, the shoreline from New London arrived, also eastbound. The conductors argued for some time which should have the right of way. The boat train was finally allowed to start out first, and it clattered away into the night, toward the westerly and unforeseen disaster. About 8 miles east of Westerly was Richmond Switch, shortly to be named Wood River Junction, where the Hope Valley Branch Road met with the main line. It was at that time a siding where freights could be sidetracked for faster passenger trains to pass. A little stream known as Meadow Brook, which flowed under the railroad near the Richmond switch, had been dammed to create a pond which provided power for a grist mill operated by Mr. R.E. Ennis. The pond was very high from heavy rains. On the morning of April 19th, the dam broke, carrying away the bridge and abutments where the railroad crossed the river. Running late, the train rushed down the grade approaching Meadow Brook and plunged into the chasm, now more than 40 feet wide, where the bridge had been. The locomotive buried itself in the opposite bank with the coal tender turned over upon it. The second-class car went down into the riverbed almost completely telescoped by the leading first-class car. The following car and smoker stayed on the track. Fire immediately started from the engine boiler and stoves in the cars. The wooden cars were entirely consumed, along with many passengers who were unable to extract themselves from the wreck. Conductor Gardner, who was in the rear car at the time, was able to prevent a worse disaster from flagging down the shoreline train, which is following closely. Out of the 106 passengers and crew on the train that morning, over 50 were killed and many others severely injured. Rescue trains were immediately sent out from Providence and Westerly, rushing many local doctors to the scene. Crowds gathered all day at the station of Providence and at the SWAT's funeral home, where many of the bodies were brought. Many people journeyed to the scene of the tragedy to watch the clearing of the wreck and construction of a temporary bridge. It was almost 3 days before trains were able to pass over the line. The disaster was a source of conversation for many months and had wide publicity throughout the whole country, making for better inspection of railroad tracks and bridges everywhere. The story that engineer Guile, who lived near the track just south of Providence, saluted his wife each morning as he passed with 2 short blasts of the whistle, brought forth a poem in the New York Herald by the well-known author Bret Harte. The last verse we quote. And then one morning it was heard no more, from Stonington over Rhode Island's shore. The folk in Providence smiled and said, as they turned in their beds, the engineer has for once forgotten his morning cheer. But little they knew that to his trust true, Guile lay under his engine dead.